The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Jefferson Middle School as Marcus Cole stepped out of his old pickup truck. The autumn air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves, and somewhere in the distance, a group of early arriving students laughed as they made their way toward the main entrance. Marcus paused for a moment, taking in the scene with the same quiet alertness that had kept him alive through 3 combat deployments. Old habits, he reminded himself. They never really die. At 42 years old, Marcus still carried himself with the bearing of a warrior, though the uniform had been traded for a simple maintenance worker's outfit. His broad shoulders and weathered face told stories he rarely shared, and his eyes, deep brown and perpetually watchful, missed nothing. He grabbed his toolbox from the truck bed and headed toward the school, his work boots crunching against the gravel. "Morning, mister." "Cole!" called out Principal Diana Hartwell from the front steps. She was a tall woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun, and she held a steaming cup of coffee like it was her lifeline. "Morning, ma'am," Marcus replied with a slight nod. "Looks like we've got a good day ahead." "Let's hope so. The heating system in the East Wing has been making that noise again. Think you can take a look before third period?" "Already on my list." Diana smiled. She'd been the one to hire Marcus 3 years ago, seeing past the sparse resume and the gaps that spoke of classified operations. She'd recognized something in him that day, a man searching for purpose, for a reason to keep moving forward. The school had given him that, in its own quiet way. Marcus made his way through the familiar corridors, nodding at teachers setting up their classrooms and custodians pushing their carts. The walls were lined with student artwork, motivational posters, and photographs from various school events. It was a world away from the places he'd been, and yet sometimes, in the quiet moments, he could still hear the echoes of gunfire, still feel the weight of the men he'd lost. He shook off the memories and focused on the present. That was the trick, really. 1 foot in front of the other, one task at a time. The morning passed in a blur of routine maintenance. A stuck locker here, a flickering light there, the mysterious heating system that seemed to have developed a personality of its own. By the time the lunch bell rang, Marcus had worked up enough of an appetite to justify the sandwich he'd packed that morning. He found his usual spot near the back of the cafeteria, close enough to keep an eye on things, but far enough to avoid being in the way. The noise of hundreds of students talking and laughing washed over him like white noise, almost soothing in its predictability. That's when he first noticed the boy. He was sitting alone at a table near the emergency exit, hunched over a tray of untouched food. His clothes were clean but worn, the kind of hand-me-downs that had seen too many owners. But it wasn't the clothes that caught Marcus's attention. It was the way the boy held himself, the careful, deliberate movements of someone trying not to aggravate an injury they didn't want anyone to see. Marcus had seen that posture before, in countless villages across the world where children learned too early that pain was something to be hidden, not treated. The boy couldn't have been more than 12, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that seemed too old for his face. When he reached for his milk carton, his sleeve rode up just enough to reveal the edge of a bruise, dark purple fading to yellow-green, the kind that came from a grip too tight, held too long. Marcus felt something stir in his chest, something he'd thought had gone quiet years ago. He looked away, forced himself to take a bite of his sandwich. It wasn't his business. He was just the maintenance guy. There were counselors for this sort of thing, teachers trained to recognize the signs and follow the proper protocols. But when he looked back, the boy was staring at him. Their eyes met across the crowded cafeteria, and in that moment, Marcus saw something that cut through all his carefully constructed walls of professional distance. He saw recognition, not of him specifically, but of what he represented: safety. An adult who might actually see, who might actually care. The boy looked away quickly, gathering his tray and dumping his uneaten food into the trash. He was gone before Marcus could decide whether to say something, slipping out the emergency exit with the practiced ease of someone used to being invisible. Marcus sat there for a long moment, his sandwich forgotten in his hands. Then he stood, threw away his own lunch and went back to work. But he couldn't get the boy's eyes out of his mind. The next few days passed with Marcus keeping a careful watch, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was watching for. He learned the boy's name from a roster posted in the main office: Elijah Turner, 7th grade. He learned that Elijah was a quiet student who kept to himself, that his grades were average, that he had no behavioral issues on record. He also learned that Elijah's emergency contact was his stepfather, a man named Carl Weaver, and that his mother had passed away 2 years earlier. Car accident. No father listed. It wasn't enough to go on, not really. Plenty of kids were quiet. Plenty of kids came from broken homes and turned out just fine. But Marcus had spent too many years reading situations to dismiss the cold feeling in his gut. On Thursday afternoon, he was fixing a broken window latch in the gymnasium when he heard voices echoing from the locker room. 3 voices, loud and mocking, and one voice, smaller, trying and failing to sound brave. "Come on, Turner, just give us the money. We know your stepdad gives you lunch money every day." "I don't have anything, please. Just leave me alone." "He doesn't have anything, guys. You believe that? His stepdad's a real stand-up citizen, giving him nothing but bruises." Laughter, cruel and knowing. Marcus set down his tools quietly and moved toward the locker room door. Through the small window he could see 3 boys, 8th graders by the look of them, surrounding Elijah. The smallest of the 3 had Elijah's backpack and was rifling through it, while the other 2 blocked any escape. "What's this? A phone? Oh, wait, it's one of those cheap prepaid things. Probably doesn't even have games." "Give it back," Elijah said, his voice cracking. "Please, I need that." "You need it? For what? Calling your dead mom?" The words hit like a physical blow, and Marcus saw Elijah flinch as if he'd been struck. Something dark and cold settled in Marcus's chest. He pushed open the door. The 3 bullies spun around, their expressions shifting from cruel amusement to surprise, and then to poorly concealed fear. Marcus didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, filling the doorway with his presence, his eyes moving slowly from one boy to the next. "Mr. Cole," one of them stammered, "I know exactly what you were doing." Marcus's voice was quiet, controlled, but there was something beneath it that made all 3 boys take a step back. "Give him back his things." The boy with the backpack practically threw it at Elijah, who caught it against his chest like a shield. "Now apologize." "We're sorry," they mumbled in unison, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. "Not to me." Marcus nodded toward Elijah. "To him." "We're sorry, Elijah. We didn't mean anything by it." The words were hollow, meaningless, and everyone in the room knew it. But Marcus held the bully's gaze until they withered, then jerked his head toward the door. "Get out of here. And if I hear about anything like this happening again to anyone, I'll be having a conversation with Principal Hartwell, and your parents, and anyone else who needs to know exactly what kind of young men you're choosing to be." The 3 boys fled like their feet were on fire. Marcus waited until their footsteps faded, then turned to Elijah. The boy was still clutching his backpack, his face a careful mask of nothing, but his hands were shaking. "You okay?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice gentle. "Yeah, fine. Thanks, Mr. Cole. You know my name? Everyone knows who you are. The maintenance guy, the one who used to be a soldier." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Is that what they say? Some of the kids think you were special forces or something, like a Navy SEAL." Elijah looked up at him, and for just a moment the mask slipped. "Were you?" Marcus considered the question. The honest answer was complicated, classified, and not entirely suited for a conversation with a 12-year-old. But the boy was looking at him with such desperate hope, such need to believe that there were still heroes in the world, that Marcus couldn't bring himself to deflect. "Something like that," he said finally. "Long time ago." Elijah nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "That's cool. Not as cool as people think. Lots of paperwork." Marcus allowed himself a small smile and was rewarded with the ghost of one in return from Elijah. "Listen, those boys, have they bothered you before?" The mask came back up, quick and practiced. "It's no big deal. They're just jerks." "That's not what I asked." Elijah shifted his weight, his eyes dropping to the floor. "Sometimes I can handle it. It's fine." "I'm sure you can, but you shouldn't have to handle it alone." Marcus paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Is there anything else going on? Anything you want to talk about?" The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the things Elijah wanted to say and all the reasons he couldn't say them. Marcus recognized that silence. He'd sat with it enough times himself. "I'm fine," Elijah said finally. "Really? Can I go now?" Every instinct Marcus had was screaming that the boy was anything but fine. But he also knew that pushing too hard would only make Elijah retreat further into himself. So he stepped aside, giving the boy a clear path to the door. "If you ever need anything," Marcus said, "you know where to find me." Elijah paused at the threshold, and for just a moment, his carefully constructed walls seemed to waver. But then he nodded once, quickly, and disappeared down the hallway. Marcus stood alone in the locker room for a long time, thinking about all the children he hadn't been able to save, in places with names he couldn't pronounce. He'd told himself when he came home that he was done with all that. Done trying to fix things he couldn't fix. Done caring about people who would only end up hurting him in the end. But standing there in that empty locker room, with the echo of a desperate boy's footsteps still fading in his ears, Marcus realized that some things couldn't be undone. Some parts of who you were couldn't be buried, no matter how hard you tried. He went back to his window latch, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. Friday morning arrived with a cold drizzle that seemed to match Marcus's mood. He'd barely slept the night before, his dreams haunted by a boy with old eyes and hidden bruises. He'd considered calling someone, Child Protective Services maybe, or at least talking to Principal Hartwell. But what did he have? A gut feeling? Some bruises that could have come from anywhere? A kid who said he was fine? He knew how these things worked. Without concrete evidence, without the child's cooperation, the system would churn and grind and ultimately do nothing. And in the meantime, whoever was hurting Elijah would find out that someone had reported them, and things would get worse. So Marcus did the only thing he could do. He watched and he waited. The morning passed in its usual rhythm, but Marcus found himself taking longer routes to his various tasks, routes that just happened to take him past Elijah's classrooms, past his locker, past the corner of the cafeteria where the boy sat alone with his untouched food. It was during the lunch period that everything changed. Marcus was replacing a broken ceiling tile in the hallway outside the main office when he saw Elijah come in. The boy's face was pale, his movements stiff and careful in a way that spoke of new injuries rather than old ones. He hesitated at the office door, his hand hovering over the handle, and then seemed to make a decision. He walked past the office, past Marcus, and out the side door that led to the parking lot. Marcus set down his tools and followed. He found Elijah sitting on the curb at the far edge of the lot, away from the buses and the teacher vehicles. The drizzle had stopped, but the sky was still grey and threatening, and the boy looked impossibly small and alone against the vast expanse of empty pavement. Marcus approached slowly, making sure his footsteps were audible so as not to startle him. When he was close enough, he lowered himself down onto the curb beside Elijah, ignoring the dampness that immediately seeped through his work pants. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, side by side, watching the clouds roll across the sky. "You're supposed to be in class," Marcus said finally. "You're supposed to be fixing ceiling tiles," Elijah replied, and there was something almost approaching humor in his voice. "Ceiling tiles can wait." Marcus paused. "You want to tell me what's going on?" Elijah was quiet for so long that Marcus thought he might not answer at all. But then, slowly, the words began to come. "My stepdad," Elijah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He drinks a lot. Ever since my mom died, it's like he blames me for it, like it's my fault she was driving that night." Marcus felt his hands curl into fists at his sides, but he kept his voice steady. "Why would he blame you?" "She was coming to pick me up from a friend's house. I was supposed to stay there all night, but I got homesick and called her to come get me." Elijah's voice cracked. "If I hadn't called, she wouldn't have been on that road. She wouldn't have—" He stopped, unable to continue. The tears he'd been holding back began to fall, cutting tracks through the grime on his cheeks. Marcus sat with the weight of this revelation, feeling the raw grief and misplaced guilt that had been eating this boy alive. He'd seen it before, in soldiers who blamed themselves for split-second decisions that led to the deaths of their brothers. The logic was flawed, the self-condemnation unwarranted, but that didn't make it any less real. "Listen to me," Marcus said, turning to face Elijah directly. "What happened to your mother was an accident, a terrible, senseless accident, but it was not your fault. You were a kid who missed his mom and wanted to go home. That's the most natural thing in the world. The fault lies with whoever was driving the other car, with bad luck, with a universe that sometimes doesn't make any sense, but not with you, never with you." Elijah shook his head, the tears coming faster now. "You don't understand. Carl says—" "I don't care what Carl says." Marcus's voice hardened. "What Carl is doing to you is wrong. The bruises, the words, all of it. It's wrong, and it's not something you have to accept." Elijah looked up at him, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "But where else am I supposed to go? He's my legal guardian. I don't have any other family. If I tell anyone, they'll just put me in foster care, and I've heard what happens to kids in foster care. At least with Carl, I have a home. At least—" His voice broke again, and this time the sobs came in earnest, racking his thin frame with their force. Without thinking, Marcus reached out and pulled the boy against his shoulder, holding him the way he'd held his own daughter a lifetime ago. Before the divorce, before the deployments that stretched from months to years, before she'd stopped returning his calls. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey, it's okay. We're going to figure this out. You're not alone anymore, you understand? Whatever happens next, you're not alone." Elijah cried against his shoulder for what felt like an eternity, releasing years of pent-up grief and fear and loneliness. Marcus just held him, providing the simple human comfort that the boy had been starving for. When the sobs finally subsided, Elijah pulled back, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "Mr. Cole." His voice was small, uncertain. Can I stay with you?" The question hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. 5 simple words, carrying the weight of a child's entire future. He opened his mouth to explain all the reasons why it wasn't possible, the legalities, the procedures, the fact that he was just a maintenance worker with a past he couldn't talk about, and demons he hadn't quite conquered. But before he could say any of that, a sound cut through the morning air. Sharp, loud, unmistakable. Gunshots, coming from inside the school. Marcus was on his feet before the echo faded, every muscle in his body coiled with the familiar tension of impending combat. His mind raced through scenarios, calculating distances and entry points and potential threats. Behind him, Elijah had frozen, his face gone white with terror. "Get down!" Marcus commanded, pulling the boy behind a parked car. "Stay here. Do not move until I come back for you. Do you understand?" "Mr. Cole, do you understand?" Elijah nodded, his whole body trembling. Marcus took a breath, centering himself the way he had 1,000 times before. Then he turned and ran toward the sound of the gunfire. The school had devolved into chaos. Students and teachers were flooding out of every exit, screaming and crying, trampling each other in their desperation to escape. Marcus pushed against the tide, his eyes scanning for threats, his body moving on autopilot. He found Principal Hartwell in the main hallway, her face ashen, her hands shaking as she tried to coordinate the evacuation. "What's the situation?" Marcus demanded. "I don't know. Someone said they saw a man with a gun near the East Wing. The police are on their way. Get everyone out! West side, away from the East Wing, now!" He didn't wait for her response. He was already moving, his work boots pounding against the linoleum as he headed toward the source of the danger. The East Wing was eerily quiet, the usual buzz of activity replaced by a silence that felt heavy and wrong. Marcus moved carefully, using the cover of doorways and corners, his senses straining for any sign of the threat. He found it in the third classroom on the right. Through the window in the door, he could see a man standing at the front of the room. He was tall and thin, with wild eyes and a hunting rifle clutched in trembling hands. A dozen students were huddled in the corner, their faces streaked with tears, while their teacher, a young woman Marcus recognized as Sarah Chen, stood between them and the gunman, her arms spread wide in a gesture of protection. "Please," she was saying, her voice steady despite the fear Marcus could see in her eyes. "Please, just put the gun down. Whatever you're going through, we can help. These are children. They haven't done anything to you." "Shut up." The man's voice was raw, unhinged. "You don't know what they've done. You don't know what anyone's done. My son is dead because of this school, because of what happened to him here, and no one listened. No one ever listens." Marcus recognized the pattern. Grief twisted into rage, pain seeking an outlet through violence. He'd seen it in war zones, in the eyes of fathers who'd lost everything and had nothing left to lose. And he knew that in this state, the man was capable of anything. He also knew that he couldn't wait for the police. By the time they got here, by the time they assessed the situation and made their tactical approach, people would be dead. Marcus eased the door open, just a crack, just enough to slip through. The movement caught the gunman's attention, and the rifle swung toward him with terrifying speed. "Don't move! Who are you? You're not a cop!" "No," Marcus said, his voice calm and steady. "I'm not a cop. My name is Marcus Cole. I work here. I fix things." "Fix things?" The man let out a bitter laugh. "Can you fix my son? Can you bring him back?" "No, I can't do that. No one can." Marcus took a slow step forward, his hands raised and visible. "But I can listen. If you want to tell me about your son, I'll listen." The rifle wavered just slightly. "You don't care. None of you care. My boy was bullied every single day in this school. He came home crying, begging not to go back, and what did they do? Nothing. They did nothing. And now he's gone. I'm sorry." Marcus meant it. He thought of Elijah, alone and afraid, being tormented by boys who should have known better. He thought of all the children who fell through the cracks, while the adults around them argued about procedures and liability. "I'm truly sorry for what happened to your son. He deserved better." The man's face crumpled, and for a moment, Marcus saw the grieving father beneath the rage. He was just a kid, 15 years old. He hung himself in his bedroom because he couldn't take it anymore, and the school said there was nothing they could have done. They said, his voice broke. They said he never reported anything. Because kids don't, Marcus said softly. Because they're afraid. Because they think no one will believe them, or that telling will only make things worse. Your son wasn't weak for not speaking up. He was human. Behind the gunman, Marcus could see Mrs. Chen slowly, carefully, ushering the students toward the back of the room. If he could keep the man talking, keep his attention focused forward. I know what it's like to lose people, Marcus continued. I've lost men who were like brothers to me. I've stood at funerals and wondered why it was them and not me. And I've wanted someone to blame, someone to hurt, because the pain just doesn't make sense otherwise. But this, he gestured at the rifle, at the terrified children, at the destruction that hung in the balance. This won't bring your son back. It won't make the pain go away. It'll just create more pain, more loss, more parents having to bury their children. The man was crying now, tears streaming down his face, but his grip on the rifle hadn't loosened. Then what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to live with this? One day at a time. Sometimes 1 hour at a time. Sometimes one breath at a time. Marcus took another step forward. He was close now, close enough to see the veins standing out on the man's forearms, close enough to smell the alcohol on his breath. There's no magic answer, no shortcut through the grief. But there are people who can help, if you let them. Support groups for parents who've lost children, therapists who specialize in this kind of trauma. It won't be easy, but it's possible. I'm living proof of that. You? The man let out another bitter laugh. What do you know about loss? I know that I came back from war with more ghosts than I could count. I know that I put a gun in my mouth one night and only didn't pull the trigger because my dog started barking at a squirrel outside the window. I know that every day I wake up is a choice, a decision to keep going, even when the darkness feels like it's going to swallow me whole. The rifle lowered, just an inch. But an inch was everything. I also know, Marcus continued, that the things we do when we're in pain, the things we do when we're not thinking clearly, they stay with us forever. If you hurt these children, there's no coming back from that, not just legally, but inside yourself. Whatever part of you still loves your son, still wants to honor his memory, that part will die today, in this room, if you pull that trigger. The man was sobbing now, great racking sobs that shook his entire body. The rifle was pointing at the floor, his grip loosening, and Marcus saw his chance. He moved without thinking, covering the distance between them in 2 quick strides. His left hand grabbed the barrel of the rifle, pushing it down and away, while his right hand came up to grip the stock. The man struggled for just a moment, then seemed to deflate entirely, releasing the weapon and collapsing to his knees. Marcus quickly ejected the ammunition and set the rifle aside, then turned to Ms. Chen. Get the kids out of here. Now! She didn't need to be told twice. Within seconds, the classroom was empty except for Marcus and the broken man kneeling on the floor. Sirens were wailing in the distance, growing closer by the second. Marcus knelt down beside the man, one hand on his shoulder, keeping him steady. It's going to be okay, he said, not knowing if it was true but saying it anyway. You're going to get help. And maybe, somewhere down the line, you'll find a way to turn all this pain into something that helps other kids, like your son. It won't undo what happened, but it might give his death some meaning. It might save someone else. The man looked up at him, his eyes bloodshot and empty. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just wanted them to understand. I just wanted someone to listen. I know, and now they will. The police arrived moments later, swarming the room with weapons drawn, and shouted commands. Marcus stepped back, his hands raised, letting the professionals take over. He gave his statement quickly and efficiently, answering questions with the detached precision of someone who'd been through countless after-action debriefs. But all the while, his mind was elsewhere. It was on a boy sitting behind a car in the parking lot, waiting for someone to come back for him. It was on a question that still hung in the air between them, a question that Marcus was only now beginning to understand how to answer. When the police finally released him, Marcus walked back outside. The school had been fully evacuated, with students and staff gathered on the football field, while parents flooded the parking lot, searching desperately for their children. The news vans were already there, their cameras capturing every moment of the chaos. He found Elijah exactly where he'd left him, still crouched behind the car, his arms wrapped around his knees. When he saw Marcus approaching, the boy scrambled to his feet, his face streaked with dried tears and fresh ones. "Mr. Cole, I heard the shots, and then there were sirens, and I didn't know. I thought maybe—" "I'm okay," Marcus said, and the relief in Elijah's eyes was almost more than he could bear. "Everything's okay. It's over." Elijah launched himself at Marcus, wrapping his arms around him in a fierce hug. Marcus held him close, feeling the boy's heartbeat gradually slow from its panicked rhythm. "You came back," Elijah whispered. "You said you would, and you did." "I'll always come back," Marcus heard himself say. "You understand me. Whatever happens, I'll always come back for you." They stood there for a long moment, two broken people finding something like hope in each other's presence. Then Principal Hartwell appeared, her face haggard with stress, and reality came crashing back. "Marcus, thank God. The police told me what you did in there. You saved those children's lives. I just talked to him. Anyone could have done the same. But no one else did. You did." She put a hand on his arm, her eyes bright with gratitude. "I'm going to recommend you for a commendation. Maybe something more. The district needs to know what happened here today." Marcus shook his head. "I don't need recognition. I just need—" He looked down at Elijah, who was still pressed against his side. "I need to talk to you about something, about Elijah." Principal Hartwell's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "What about him?" "He's not safe at home. His stepfather has been hurting him, and we need to do something about it. Now, today, before that man has a chance to hurt him again." The principal looked from Marcus to Elijah, taking in the boy's defensive posture, the way he flinched when Marcus mentioned his stepfather. Something softened in her face. "I've suspected something was wrong for a while," she admitted, "but without proof. Without Elijah saying something himself." "I'm saying something now," Elijah said, his voice small but steady. "I'm saying I'm scared to go home. I'm saying he hurts me when he drinks, and he drinks every night. I'm saying I'd rather sleep on the street than go back to that house." Diana Hartwell closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, there was a new determination there. Okay, let's go inside and make some calls. CPS, the police, anyone else who needs to be involved. We're going to figure this out, Elijah. I promise you that." They walked back toward the school together, skirting the edge of the chaos. Marcus kept his hand on Elijah's shoulder, a steady presence in a world that had suddenly become very uncertain. The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls and interviews and hastily assembled crisis teams. The shooting had put the entire district on edge, and Elijah's revelation about his stepfather added another layer of urgency to an already chaotic situation. By late afternoon, a social worker named Patricia Hughes had been assigned to Elijah's case. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, with kind eyes and a voice that brooked no argument. She interviewed Elijah privately, photographing his bruises and documenting his testimony with meticulous care. When she emerged from the interview room, her expression was grim. "We're placing Elijah in emergency foster care tonight," she told Marcus and Principal Hartwell. "His stepfather is being picked up for questioning as we speak. Based on what Elijah's told me, we have more than enough for an investigation, possibly charges." "Foster care," Marcus said. the words tasting sour in his mouth. He remembered what Elijah had said about hearing horror stories, about preferring the devil he knew to the one he didn't. Patricia seemed to read his thoughts. "It's not ideal, I know, but we have some excellent emergency placements in the area. Elijah will be safe, well cared for, and we'll work on finding a more permanent solution as quickly as possible." What kind of permanent solution? The social worker studied him for a long moment. That depends on a lot of factors. Extended family, if any, can be located. Long-term foster families who are willing to take in a boy his age. Adoptive parents, though the process is lengthy and complicated. She paused. "Why do you ask?" Marcus thought about his empty apartment, his quiet life, the careful walls he'd built to keep the world at a safe distance. He thought about the look in Elijah's eyes when he'd asked if he could stay. He thought about all the chances he'd missed with his own daughter, all the years he'd been too busy fighting other people's wars to be present for the battles at home. And he thought about the feeling he'd had when he'd held Elijah in his arms, the feeling of something clicking into place, of finally finding a purpose that mattered. "Because I want to be considered," he said, "as a placement for Elijah." Principal Hartwell looked at him in surprise, but Patricia just nodded slowly, as if she'd been expecting this. "You understand what that would involve? Background checks, home inspections, training programs. The process isn't quick or easy, especially for a single man with no prior experience in foster care." "I understand. And you're willing to go through all of that?" Marcus looked through the window of the conference room where Elijah was sitting alone, his legs dangling from a chair too big for him, his face pinched with exhaustion and fear. The boy must have sensed his gaze because he looked up and their eyes met. "Yeah," Marcus said, "I am." The days that followed were among the most challenging of Marcus's life, and that was saying something for a man who'd spent years in the most dangerous places on earth. The process of becoming a licensed foster parent was every bit as grueling as Patricia had promised. There were forms to fill out, interviews to endure, references to provide. His military record was scrutinized in detail, with particular attention paid to his psychological evaluations and the circumstances of his discharge. The fact that he'd left the Navy honorably and with a chest full of medals for valor worked in his favor. The fact that he'd been struggling with PTSD when he first came home worked against it. But Marcus approached the process with the same determination he'd brought to every mission in his career. He completed the training courses ahead of schedule. He made the required modifications to his apartment, turning his spare room into a space that could reasonably be called a child's bedroom. He opened himself up to the social workers and counselors in ways that felt invasive and uncomfortable, answering questions about his past, his demons, his hopes for the future, and through it all, he visited Elijah. The boy had been placed with a retired couple named Frank and Betty Morrison, kind people who'd been fostering children for over 20 years. They treated Elijah with patience and warmth, giving him space when he needed it and comfort when he asked for it. It was, by all accounts, one of the better placements in the system, but every time Marcus visited, he could see the question in Elijah's eyes. The same question the boy had asked on that terrible day when the world had come apart at the seams. "Can I stay with you?" "I'm working on it," Marcus would tell him. "I'm doing everything I can. It's just going to take some time." "How much time?" "I don't know, but I'm not giving up. I need you to know that. Whatever happens, I'm not giving up on you." Elijah would nod, his expression carefully neutral, and Marcus would leave with his heart aching in his chest. Meanwhile, the community's response to the shooting had been overwhelming. What had happened at Jefferson Middle School became national news, and with it came an outpouring of attention that Marcus neither sought nor wanted. The local newspaper ran a profile on him, painting him as a hero who'd risked his life to save children. The school board presented him with a certificate of recognition. Parents stopped him in the street to shake his hand and thank him for his bravery. He accepted all of it with quiet grace, deflecting praise and redirecting attention whenever possible. The truth was, he didn't feel like a hero. He'd just done what needed to be done, what anyone with his training and experience would have done in the same situation. The real heroes, as far as he was concerned, were people like Ms. Chen, who'd put her own body between her students and danger without a moment's hesitation. People like Principal Hartwell, who'd kept the school running through the chaos and its aftermath. People like the Morrisons, who'd opened their home to a wounded boy and loved him without expecting anything in return. But the attention did serve one useful purpose. It gave weight to his application to become Elijah's foster father. 3 months after the shooting, Patricia Hughes called him with news. "The review board has approved your application," she said, and Marcus could hear the smile in her voice. "You're officially certified as a foster parent in the state of Virginia, and I've put in a recommendation that Elijah be transferred to your care as soon as possible." Marcus closed his eyes, letting the words wash over him. 3 months of uncertainty, of waiting, of hoping against hope, and now, finally, it was real. "When?" he managed to ask. "Assuming everything goes smoothly with the transition plan, we're looking at about 2 weeks. We want to make sure Elijah has time to prepare, to say goodbye to the Morrisons, to feel like he has some control over what's happening to him. Of course, whatever's best for him." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Marcus, I want you to know what you're doing, taking on a child with Elijah's history, his trauma. It's not going to be easy. There will be good days and bad days. There will be times when he pushes you away, tests your limits, acts out in ways that don't make sense. You need to be prepared for that." "I am. I hope so, because that boy has been through enough disappointment for a lifetime. He needs someone who's going to stick around no matter how hard things get." Marcus thought about all the times he'd failed to stick around, for his daughter, for his ex-wife, for the men who'd served under him and come home broken. He thought about the promises he'd made and couldn't keep, the letters he'd meant to write and never did, the phone calls that came too late. "I'm not going to fail him," he said. "I promise you that. I believe you. That's why I fought so hard for this placement." Patricia's voice softened. "Take care of yourself too, Marcus. You can't pour from an empty cup." 2 weeks later, on a crisp December morning, Marcus pulled up to the Morrisons' house to bring Elijah home. The boy was waiting on the front porch, a small suitcase beside him and a backpack slung over his shoulder. He'd grown in the months since they'd first met, a subtle shift in height and bearing that spoke of a child on the cusp of adolescence. But his eyes were the same, old and watchful and desperately hopeful. Betty Morrison came out to see them off, pressing a container of homemade cookies into Elijah's hands and enveloping him in a fierce hug. "You call us if you need anything," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Any time, day or night. You hear me?" "Yes, ma'am. And you." She turned to Marcus, fixing him with a look that combined warmth and warning in equal measure. "You take care of this boy. He's special." "I know he is." Frank appeared in the doorway, nodding at Marcus with the silent understanding of one veteran to another. No words were necessary. The drive to Marcus's apartment took 20 minutes, during which neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was more like the silence of two people who'd already said everything that needed to be said, and were now just learning how to exist in each other's presence. When they arrived, Marcus carried Elijah's suitcase up the 2 flights of stairs while the boy followed behind, taking in his new surroundings with cautious curiosity. The apartment was modest but clean, with second-hand furniture and walls that could use a fresh coat of paint. Not much to look at, maybe, but it was home. "This is your room," Marcus said, opening the door to what had once been his storage space. He'd spent weeks transforming it, clearing out boxes and adding a bed, a desk, a small bookshelf. The walls were bare. He'd left them that way on purpose, figuring Elijah should have the chance to make the space his own. Elijah stepped inside, his eyes sweeping over every detail. He ran his hand along the quilt on the bed, the one Marcus had bought specifically because it reminded him of something his own grandmother might have made. "It's mine?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "For real?" "For real, for as long as you want it." The boy turned to face him, and Marcus saw that his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. "Why are you doing this?" "I don't understand. You barely know me." Marcus leaned against the doorframe, considering the question. It deserved an honest answer, even if that answer was complicated. "You know what I did before I came to the school? Before I was fixing ceiling tiles and unjamming lockers?" Elijah nodded. "You were a soldier, a SEAL." "That's right. For 18 years, my job was to protect people, to go into dangerous places and make sure the bad guys didn't win. And I was good at it, really good. But then I came home, and there was no one left to protect, no mission, no purpose. I spent 2 years just existing, going through the motions, wondering what the point of it all was." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "And then I met you. This kid who'd been through more pain than anyone his age should have to deal with, who was fighting his own battles every single day, who just needed someone to see him, someone to say, 'I've got you, you're not alone anymore.'" Marcus straightened, meeting Elijah's gaze directly. "You asked me why I'm doing this. The truth is, you're not the only one who needed saving. When I saw you that first day in the cafeteria, when I saw you sitting alone with all that hurt hidden behind your eyes, something woke up in me that I thought had died a long time ago. You gave me a reason to keep going, Elijah. A reason to be better. So maybe the question isn't why I'm doing this for you. Maybe the question is why you're doing this for me." Elijah was crying now, the tears he'd been holding back finally breaking free. He crossed the room in 3 quick steps and threw his arms around Marcus, burying his face in his chest. "Thank you," he choked out. "Thank you for not giving up." Marcus held him close, blinking back tears of his own. "Never. You hear me? Never." They stayed like that for a long time, 2 wounded souls finding shelter in each other, learning what it meant to be a family. The first few months were exactly as hard as Patricia had warned. Elijah had nightmares, bad ones that left him screaming in the dark, thrashing against phantom hands that reached for him from the shadows. Marcus would come running at the first sound, sitting on the edge of the bed, speaking in low, soothing tones, until the terror passed. Some nights, Elijah would let himself be comforted. Other nights, he'd push Marcus away, curling into a ball and refusing to be touched. There were good days, too. Days when they'd sit on the couch watching old war movies, Marcus explaining the tactical errors, while Elijah rolled his eyes and threw popcorn at him. Days when they'd go for walks in the park, talking about nothing and everything, building the kind of easy rapport that comes from simply spending time together. Days when Elijah would come home from school with a genuine smile on his face, eager to share some small victory or interesting thing he'd learned. But the bad days were hard, really hard. The first time Elijah ran away, Marcus spent 12 hours searching the streets, calling everyone he could think of, fighting down the panic that threatened to overwhelm him. He finally found the boy huddled under an overpass, shivering in the cold, his face a mask of defiance and fear. "I had to see if you'd come looking," Elijah said when Marcus found him. "Everyone else always gave up. I had to know if you would too." Marcus sat down beside him on the cold concrete, not caring about the filth or the danger or the exhaustion weighing on his bones. "I will always come looking," he said. "You can run as far as you want, as many times as you need to. I will always come looking. That's what family does." Elijah broke down then, all his walls crumbling at once. He cried for his mother, for the father he'd never known, for the stepfather who'd turned his grief into violence. He cried for all the years he'd spent feeling worthless and invisible and alone. And Marcus held him through all of it, a steady presence in the storm. They walked home together as the sun came up, Elijah's hand in his, and something fundamental shifted between them. The testing wasn't over, it would never really be over, but a foundation had been laid. A foundation of trust, of commitment, of love that didn't come with conditions or expiration dates. As the months passed, Elijah began to heal. He started seeing a therapist twice a week, a patient woman named Dr. Oyelaran, who specialized in childhood trauma. The sessions were difficult at first. Elijah was resistant to opening up, suspicious of anyone who claimed to want to help. But gradually, he began to make progress. He learned to name his emotions, to recognize his triggers, to develop coping strategies for when the darkness threatened to pull him under. His grades improved. He made a friend, a quiet, bookish girl named Maya, who shared his love of fantasy novels and terrible puns. He joined the school's chess club and discovered a talent for strategic thinking that surprised everyone, including himself. And somewhere along the way, he stopped calling Marcus Mr. Cole and started calling him Dad. The first time it happened was an accident. They were in the kitchen, Marcus attempting to make pancakes while Elijah offered unhelpful commentary from his perch on the counter. "You're supposed to flip them before they burn, Dad," Elijah said, then froze, his eyes going wide. Marcus felt something catch in his chest. He turned slowly, spatula in hand, and found Elijah staring at him with a mixture of hope and terror. "I'm sorry," the boy stammered. "I didn't mean, I know you're not really—" "Elijah?" Marcus set down the spatula and crossed to where the boy sat. He put his hands on Elijah's shoulders, looking directly into his eyes. "You can call me whatever you want to call me, but I want you to know you're my son. Maybe not by blood, maybe not officially yet, but in every way that matters. You're my son, and I'm proud to be your dad." The tears came then for both of them, and the pancakes burned beyond salvation. They ended up ordering pizza instead, sitting on the floor of the living room and laughing at the absurdity of it all, and Marcus couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so complete. A year after Elijah came to live with him, Marcus filed the paperwork to officially adopt him. The process was long and complicated, requiring multiple court appearances and an endless parade of forms and interviews. Carl Weaver, who had pleaded guilty to child abuse charges and was serving time in a minimum security prison, had to formally terminate his parental rights. Extended family members had to be contacted and given the opportunity to contest the adoption. But in the end, none of them did. Elijah's only living relatives, a great-aunt in Florida and a cousin in Texas, both declined to be involved, citing their own circumstances and limitations. It was a rejection that stung, but also a clarity. There was no one else. There was only Marcus. The final hearing took place on a Tuesday in June, exactly 2 years after the day they'd first met. The courtroom was small and slightly shabby, with fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead, and a judge who looked like he'd seen it all and then some. But to Marcus and Elijah, it felt like a cathedral. Principal Hartwell was there, along with Patricia Hughes and Dr. Oyelaran and a handful of teachers from the school. Betty and Frank Morrison sat in the back row, beaming with pride. Even Maya had come, clutching a handmade card that said, "Congrats on your forever family," in sparkly letters. The judge reviewed the case files, asked a few routine questions, and then looked at Elijah with a kind smile. "Young man, this court has the power to grant or deny this adoption, but before I make my decision, I want to hear from you. Do you want Marcus Cole to be your father? your legal permanent forever father? Elijah stood up, his voice clear and strong. Yes, Your Honor, more than anything. And Marcus Cole, do you understand the responsibilities you're taking on? The legal, financial, and emotional obligations of being this child's parent? Marcus rose to stand beside Elijah. I do, Your Honor, and I accept them freely and without reservation. The judge nodded, and for just a moment, Marcus could have sworn he saw a glimmer of moisture in the old man's eyes. Then, by the power vested in me by the state of Virginia, I hereby grant this petition for adoption. From this day forward, Elijah Turner shall be legally known as Elijah Cole. He shall have all the rights and privileges of a natural-born child, and Marcus Cole shall have all the rights and responsibilities of a legal parent. He banged his gavel, and the courtroom erupted in cheers. Marcus turned to Elijah, his son, officially and forever, and pulled him into a hug that seemed to contain all the years of loneliness and loss that had led them to this moment. He could feel the boy crying against his chest, could feel his own tears running down his cheeks, and he didn't care who saw. I love you, Dad, Elijah whispered. I love you too, son. I love you too. Later that evening, after the celebrations had wound down and the well-wishers had gone home, Marcus and Elijah sat on the fire escape outside their apartment, watching the sun set over the city. So, what happens now? Elijah asked. What do you mean? I mean, we did it. I'm officially your kid. The adoption is final. What comes next? Marcus considered the question. It was a good one, the kind of question that didn't have an easy answer. Now we just live, he said finally. We wake up every day, and we do our best, and we take care of each other. Sometimes it'll be hard, and sometimes it'll be easy. But whatever it is, we'll face it together. Elijah nodded slowly, absorbing this. That sounds good, he said. That sounds really good. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the colors shift and change as the day gave way to night. Marcus thought about all the roads that had led him here, the battles fought and won, the battles fought and lost, the years of wandering in search of a purpose that always seemed just out of reach. And he thought about how strange it was, how beautiful and unexpected and strange, that his purpose had found him in the most unlikely of places, not on a distant battlefield, but in a middle school cafeteria. Not in the eyes of an enemy, but in the eyes of a lonely boy who just wanted someone to see him. Hey, Dad. Elijah's voice pulled him back to the present. Yeah? Thanks for coming back for me. In the parking lot after the shooting. I know you could have just stayed inside, helped the cops or whatever, but you came back for me instead. Marcus smiled, remembering that terrible day, the fear and the chaos and the desperate need to reach the boy he'd left behind. I told you I would. I made a promise. I know, but promises don't mean anything unless you keep them, and you did. You kept every single one. Marcus reached over and ruffled Elijah's hair, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Always will, he said, always will. The stars were beginning to emerge, faint pinpricks of light against the deepening blue. Father and son sat side by side, their shoulders touching, their hearts full, and the night wrapped around them like a benediction. 6 months after the adoption, Elijah won his first chess tournament. It was a regional competition, nothing too fancy, held in the gymnasium of a neighboring high school. But to Elijah, who had never won anything in his life, it felt like conquering the world. Marcus sat in the bleachers with the other parents, watching as his son outmaneuvered opponents twice his age. He didn't understand half of what was happening on the board. Chess had never been his game, but he recognized the look of fierce concentration on Elijah's face, the way his eyes narrowed as he calculated moves and counter-moves. It was the look of a warrior, a look Marcus knew well. When the final match was over and Elijah's victory was announced, the boy looked up and found Marcus in the crowd. The grin that spread across his face was worth more than any medal or trophy or certificate of commendation. "Did you see that?" Elijah demanded afterward, practically vibrating with excitement. "Did you see that last move? He didn't even see it coming." "I saw it. I have no idea what you did, but I saw it. It's called a fork. You attack two pieces at once, so no matter which one they save, they lose the other. I've been practicing it for weeks." Marcus laughed, pulling his son into a one-armed hug. "I'm proud of you, kiddo, really proud." The moment was interrupted by a woman's voice, hesitant and trembling. "Marcus? Marcus Cole?" He turned and felt the world tilt beneath his feet. She was older than he remembered, her hair shot through with grey, and her face lined with the passage of years. But there was no mistaking those eyes, green and fierce, the same eyes that stared back at him from the mirror every morning. "Sarah," he breathed. His daughter, the one he'd left behind when the deployment stretched from months to years, the one who'd stopped returning his calls, stopped answering his letters, stopped believing that he would ever put his family before his duty. "I saw the article," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About the shooting, about what you did. I've been trying to work up the courage to reach out, and then I heard you were going to be here today, and I just—" She stopped, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry for everything, for the things I said, for the years I wasted being angry, for not being there when you needed me." Marcus stood frozen, 20 years of regret and longing and unanswered prayers crystallizing in a single moment. He was dimly aware of Elijah watching, his trophy clutched in his hands, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. And then he moved, closing the distance between himself and his daughter, gathering her into his arms, the way he'd done when she was small, and the world was simple, and fathers were invincible. "I'm sorry, too," he said, his voice breaking, "for all of it. For not being there, for choosing the mission over you, for not fighting harder to stay connected. I never stopped loving you, Sarah, not for a single day." They held each other while the world went on around them, oblivious to the small miracle taking place in a high school gymnasium. When they finally pulled apart, Sarah's eyes fell on Elijah. "Is this him? The boy from the article?" "This is my son," Marcus said, and the words felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Elijah, this is your sister, Sarah." Elijah's eyes went wide. Sarah smiled through her tears, and Marcus saw something of himself in the expression, a capacity for love that had survived despite everything. "Nice to meet you, Elijah. I hear you're pretty good at chess." The conversation that followed was awkward and halting, 2 decades of distance not easily bridged. But by the time they said goodbye, with promises to stay in touch, to meet for dinner, to begin the slow process of rebuilding what had been lost, Marcus felt something shift in his chest. The family he'd always wanted, the family he'd thought he'd lost forever, was starting to come together. Not in the way he'd imagined, not in the way he'd planned, but in a way that was somehow better than either. That night, after Elijah had gone to bed with his trophy on the nightstand beside him, Marcus sat alone in the living room, looking at an old photograph. It showed him as a young man, barely out of his teens, holding a newborn baby in his arms. Sarah, on the day she was born. He'd thought he knew what love was back then. He'd thought he understood what it meant to be a father. He was only beginning to understand now. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Thank you for not giving up on any of us." He typed back, "That's what family does." And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Marcus Cole went to sleep with a smile on his face. A year later, things had changed in ways Marcus never could have predicted. Sarah had moved closer, taking a job at a non-profit organization that worked with veterans struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. She'd started coming over for dinner every Sunday, and she and Elijah had developed an easy rapport that made Marcus's heart ache in the best possible way. She told stories about her father's awkward attempts at parenting when she was young, the burned dinners, the forgotten school pickups, the time he'd accidentally put her in a pink dress for a costume day that called for blue. And Elijah would laugh until tears streamed down his face. "Your dad was a disaster," Sarah said one evening, grinning at Marcus over her glass of wine. "Was?" Marcus replied, raising an eyebrow. "Past tense implies improvement. You've improved." "Slightly." "The pancakes last week were almost edible." "They were delicious," Elijah insisted. "You're just biased because you've never had to eat field rations." "Field rations? Dad's been teaching me survival skills. You know, in case of emergencies." Sarah looked at Marcus with an expression caught between amusement and alarm. "What kind of emergencies are you preparing a 12-year-old for?" "All kinds. It never hurts to be prepared." "He taught me how to start a fire with a battery and steel wool," Elijah added proudly, "and how to purify water using a sock and charcoal." "A sock?" "A clean sock, obviously." The laughter that filled the apartment was the kind Marcus had always imagined but never dared to hope for. It was the sound of family, messy, imperfect, complicated, and utterly irreplaceable. But not everything was easy. Elijah's stepfather, Carl Weaver, was released from prison on parole after serving 18 months of his 3-year sentence. The news arrived in a phone call from Patricia Hughes, who delivered it with the same measured calm she brought to everything. "He's required to stay away from Elijah," she assured Marcus. "There's a restraining order in place, and his parole conditions explicitly forbid any contact. But I wanted you to know, so you could prepare." "Prepare for what?" "For whatever feelings this might bring up, for Elijah and for you." Marcus told Elijah that evening, sitting across from him at the kitchen table. He watched his son's face cycle through a range of emotions: fear, anger, confusion, and finally something that looked almost like pity. "He's out," Elijah said. "Just like that? He served his time. That's how the system works. The system is stupid, sometimes, but it's what we have." Elijah was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, younger, stripped of the confidence he'd built up over the past 2 years. "Do you think he'll try to find me?" Marcus reached across the table and took his son's hands in his own. "I don't know, but I want you to know this. If he does, he'll have to go through me first, and I promise you, that's not a fight he's going to win." The words were meant to comfort, but Marcus could see that they weren't quite enough. The fear was still there, lurking behind Elijah's eyes, threatening to undo all the progress he'd made. That night, Marcus lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and thinking about all the ways he could protect his son. Legal measures, physical measures, contingency plans for every scenario he could imagine. The warrior in him was awake again, alert and ready for battle. But as the night wore on, a different thought began to take shape. Maybe protection wasn't just about keeping threats at bay. Maybe it was also about giving Elijah the tools to face his fears, to understand that he was stronger than he knew. The next morning, Marcus made a decision. "I want to tell you something," he said over breakfast, "about my time in the service, about the things I did and the things that happened to me." Elijah looked up from his cereal, surprised. Marcus had always been reticent about his past, offering only the broadest outlines when asked. He'd told himself it was to protect Elijah from the harsh realities, but he was beginning to wonder if it was really to protect himself. "Okay," Elijah said. "I'm listening." So Marcus talked. He told Elijah about the missions he could speak of and the ones he couldn't. He told him about the friends he'd made and the friends he'd lost. He told him about the time a grenade landed 6 feet from where he was standing, and how the only reason he survived was because one of his teammates threw himself on top of it, absorbing the blast with his own body. "His name was Rodriguez," Marcus said, his voice rough. "We called him Rico. He had a wife and a little girl back home, a girl about your age. He saved my life, and I've spent every day since then trying to figure out if I'm worth what he gave up." Elijah was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "He thought you were worth it. That's why he did it." "Yeah, maybe. Or maybe he just acted on instinct, the way we were trained. I'll never know for sure. Does it matter?" Marcus considered the question. It was the kind of question that didn't have an easy answer. "I used to think it did. I used to lie awake at night, running through all the things I could have done differently, all the ways I could have been the one to make that sacrifice instead of him. But over time, I realized that the best way to honor Rico wasn't to torture myself with what-ifs. It was to live a life that was worth saving." He looked at Elijah, really looked at him, seeing not just the boy he'd become, but the man he was growing into. "That's what you're doing, you know. Every time you face your fears, every time you get back up after getting knocked down, you're proving that the life you're building is worth something. You're not defined by the things that happen to you or the people who hurt you. You're defined by what you do next." Elijah absorbed this in silence. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. "That's pretty good, Dad. Did you rehearse that?" Marcus laughed, the tension breaking like a wave against the shore. "Maybe a little." "Was it too much?" "Maybe a little, but I'll take it." They finished their breakfast together, the weight of the world a little lighter on both their shoulders. And when Elijah left for school that morning, there was something different in his step, something that looked a lot like hope. Months passed, and the threat of Carl Weaver faded into the background of their lives. There were no unexpected encounters, no menacing phone calls, no shadows lurking in the corners. Marcus allowed himself to relax just a little, even as some part of him remained forever vigilant. Elijah turned 13, then 14. He shot up 6 inches in a single year, his voice cracking and deepening as his body caught up with the old soul it contained. He made the honor roll, joined the debate team, asked a girl to the school dance, and was over the moon when she said yes. And somewhere along the way, the wounds began to heal. Not completely, some scars never fully fade, but enough to allow for joy, for laughter, for a future that seemed bright instead of terrifying. Sarah got engaged to a physical therapist named James, a quiet man with kind eyes who looked at her like she hung the moon. Marcus walked her down the aisle at a small ceremony in the park, Elijah standing beside him as the best man, and when she said, "I do," he felt the last of his regrets dissolve into the autumn air. "Thank you," Sarah said afterward, pulling him aside while the guests mingled and laughed, "for coming back, for being here. I know it wasn't easy, and I know I didn't make it any easier." "You're my daughter," Marcus said simply. "I was always going to come back." At 15, Elijah was accepted into a summer program for gifted students, a month-long intensive at a university 300 miles away. He was nervous and excited in equal measure, packing and repacking his suitcase a dozen times before Marcus finally intervened. "You're going to be fine," he said, watching his son agonize over which books to bring. "More than fine. You're going to be amazing. What if I'm not? What if I don't fit in, or the other kids don't like me, or then you'll handle it, the same way you've handled everything else life has thrown at you." Marcus put a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You're one of the strongest people I know, kid, and that's saying something, coming from a guy who's met a lot of strong people." Elijah stopped fussing with his suitcase and looked at his father, really looked at him, the way you look at someone you're about to miss terribly. "I love you, Dad. I love you too, son. Now finish packing. We've got an early start tomorrow. The drive to the university was long and quiet, filled with the unspoken thoughts of two people who'd learned to communicate as much through silence as through words. When they arrived, Elijah's nerves returned in full force, but he squared his shoulders and faced the unknown with the courage Marcus had always known he possessed. "Call me if you need anything," Marcus said, pulling him into a fierce hug. "Day or night. I mean it. I will. I promise." And then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd of eager young minds, and Marcus stood alone in the parking lot, feeling the peculiar ache of a parent watching their child take another step toward independence. He drove home slowly, taking the scenic route, letting his thoughts wander where they would. He thought about the boy Elijah had been when they first met. Frightened and alone, hiding his bruises from a world that had never given him a reason to trust. He thought about the young man Elijah was becoming, confident and kind, with a mind that blazed like a torch and a heart that held more compassion than seemed humanly possible. He thought about all the roads that had led him here, the battles fought and the scars earned, the moments of despair and the glimmers of grace, and he thought about what it meant to be a father, not just a protector or a provider, but a witness to the miracle of a life unfolding. When he got home, the apartment was quiet in a way it hadn't been for years. Marcus walked through the rooms, touching familiar objects, remembering the laughter and the tears and the 1,000 ordinary moments that had added up to something extraordinary. On the refrigerator, held in place by a magnet shaped like a chess piece, was a photograph from the adoption ceremony. Marcus and Elijah, their arms around each other, grinning at the camera with the kind of joy that couldn't be faked. Beneath it, in Elijah's careful handwriting, were the words, "The start of our forever family." Marcus stood there for a long time, looking at the photograph, feeling the weight of all those years and all that love. Then he pulled out his phone and typed a message to Elijah, "Made it home safe. Miss you already. Call when you can." The response came almost immediately. "Miss you too, Dad. Already made 2 friends. Talk tonight?" Marcus smiled, typing back, "Wouldn't miss it." He put the phone down and looked around the empty apartment, and for the first time the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt like potential, like a chapter waiting to be written. He'd spent so many years searching for his purpose, believing it lay in distant battlefields and classified missions, but it had been here all along, waiting for him in the eyes of a wounded boy who just needed someone to see him. Marcus Cole, former Navy SEAL, had found his final mission. And it was everything he'd ever dreamed it would be. The summer passed quickly, marked by phone calls and care packages, and the occasional video chat that always seemed to end too soon. Elijah thrived in the program, tackling advanced coursework and making friends with a group of fellow students who shared his intellectual curiosity. He sent Marcus photos of late-night study sessions and weekend adventures, each one a window into a world that was expanding beyond anything either of them had imagined. When the program ended and Elijah came home, he was different in ways both subtle and profound. He carried himself with a new confidence, spoke with an authority born of experience rather than bravado. He was still the same boy Marcus had pulled out of the darkness, but he was also becoming someone new. Someone bright and strong and ready to take on the world. "So, what's next?" Marcus asked one evening as they sat on the fire escape, a tradition that had survived all the changes in their lives. "College, eventually. I've been looking at some programs. Engineering, maybe, or computer science. Something where I can build things, create things." Elijah paused, his eyes distant. "I want to make a difference, you know, like you did. I fixed ceiling tiles and unjammed lockers. You saved lives. You saved mine." Marcus felt the familiar ache in his chest, the one that came whenever Elijah reminded him of how far they'd come. "You saved yourself. I just showed up. You showed up when no one else would. That's everything, Dad." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the city lights flicker below them. After a while, Elijah spoke again. "I've been thinking about something. About the shooting and the man who did it. About his son." They rarely talked about that day, the memories still too raw for casual conversation. "What about him?" "He was bullied, just like I was, and no one helped him, just like no one helped me, until you came along." Elijah's voice was measured, thoughtful. "I keep thinking about all the kids out there who are in the same situation, who don't have anyone looking out for them. Kids who are one bad day away from making a terrible decision, either to themselves or to someone else. That's a heavy thing to carry." "I know, but I can't stop thinking about it." Elijah turned to face his father. What if there was a way to help them, to reach them before it's too late? Some kind of program or organization that could identify kids at risk and connect them with mentors who understand what they're going through. Marcus felt something stir in his chest, pride maybe, or hope. "That's a big idea." "I know it is, but every big idea starts somewhere." Elijah's eyes were bright with determination. "I've been researching it. There are some existing programs, but they're underfunded and understaffed. Most of them can't even scratch the surface of the need that's out there. But what if we could change that? What if we could build something bigger, better, something that could actually make a dent?" "We?" Elijah smiled. "Well, I'm going to need some help, and I know this guy who's pretty good at protecting people." Marcus looked at his son, really looked at him, seeing not just the boy he'd rescued, but the man who was already starting to change the world. "Tell me more," he said, and Elijah did. Over the next few months, their dining room became a makeshift headquarters. Papers covered every surface: research on existing mentorship programs, statistics on youth mental health, grant applications and funding proposals. Sarah joined them when she could, lending her non-profit expertise to the growing operation. Even James got involved, connecting them with therapists and counselors who were passionate about the cause. They called it the Elijah Project. The mission was simple: pair at-risk youth with trained mentors who could provide guidance, support, and most importantly, hope. The execution was anything but simple, requiring countless hours of planning and fundraising and bureaucratic navigation. But slowly, steadily, the pieces began to fall into place. The first mentor training session was held in the gymnasium of Jefferson Middle School, the same room where Marcus had confronted those bullies years ago. 30 volunteers showed up, teachers and parents and community members, all eager to make a difference. Marcus led the session, drawing on his decades of experience to teach them about situational awareness, active listening, and the art of meeting people where they are. The most important thing, he told them, is showing up. Not just once, not just when it's convenient, but consistently. These kids have been let down by adults their whole lives. Your job is to prove that it doesn't have to be that way. Principal Hartwell was there, older now but no less determined. She'd retired the previous year, but she'd insisted on being part of this initiative. "This is what Jefferson needed all along," she told Marcus afterward. "A way to catch the kids who fall through the cracks. If we'd had something like this when that man's son was suffering, maybe things would have turned out differently." "Maybe," Marcus agreed. "But we can't change the past. We can only do better going forward." The first cohort of mentees entered the program that fall. 10 students, carefully selected from a pool of referrals provided by school counselors across the district. Each was assigned a mentor based on shared interests and compatible personalities, and the matches were reviewed and adjusted as needed. The results weren't immediate, Nothing worthwhile ever is. But they were real. One by one, the students began to open up, to trust, to believe that they deserved something better than what life had handed them. Test scores improved. Behavioral incidents declined. Parents reported fewer problems at home. And Elijah was at the center of it all, working alongside his father to build something neither of them could have created alone. On the one-year anniversary of the project's launch, they held a small celebration at Marcus's apartment. The original 30 volunteers had grown to over 100, serving students at 6 schools across the region. Local news outlets had picked up the story, and donations were starting to flow in from unexpected sources. "Not bad for a ceiling tile fixer and a chess nerd," Sarah said, raising a glass. "Not bad at all," Marcus agreed. Elijah stepped forward, clearing his throat. He was 16 now, tall and lanky, with his father's watchful eyes and his mother's quiet strength. "I want to say something," he began, his voice carrying across the room. "When I was younger, I used to believe that I was invisible, that no one could see me, and even if they could, they wouldn't care what they saw. I spent years hiding my pain, convinced that I was broken beyond repair." He paused, his gaze finding Marcus in the crowd. "And then this guy showed up, this random maintenance worker who should have just minded his own business but didn't. He saw me. He cared. He showed up again and again, even when I pushed him away, even when I gave him every reason to give up. And because of that, I'm standing here today." The room was silent, every eye fixed on the young man at its center. "What we're building here isn't just a program. It's a promise that no kid has to be invisible, a promise that there will always be someone who sees them, who cares about them, who shows up for them no matter what. That's what the Elijah Project is, and that's what I'm going to spend the rest of my life building." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Marcus barely heard it. He was too busy blinking back tears, too busy marveling at the extraordinary human being his son had become. After the celebration wound down and the guests departed, Marcus found Elijah on the fire escape, their familiar perch. The city spread out below them, a tapestry of lights and shadows, of lives being lived in all their messy complexity. "That was quite a speech," Marcus said, lowering himself down beside his son. "Yeah, well, I learned from the best." "Your therapist?" "My dad." They shared a smile, the kind that contained years of shared history and unspoken understanding. "I'm proud of you," Marcus said, "in case I don't say it enough. You say it plenty, but I never get tired of hearing it." "Good, because I plan on saying it for a very long time." Elijah leaned his head against his father's shoulder, the way he'd done when he was small and afraid and didn't know if tomorrow would ever come. "Thanks, Dad," he said quietly, "for everything." Marcus wrapped an arm around his son, holding him close. He thought about the question Elijah had asked all those years ago, on a day when the world was falling apart and nothing seemed certain. "Can I stay with you?" He'd answered that question 1,000 times since then, in 1,000 different ways, with every meal he'd cooked and every nightmare he'd soothed, with every hard conversation and every comfortable silence, with every step he'd taken on this strange and beautiful journey called family. And he would keep answering it every day for as long as he had breath in his body. "Always," he said into the darkness, "always." The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the small dramas playing out below. But to Marcus and Elijah, sitting on a fire escape in a rundown apartment building, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and a future full of promise, the universe had never seemed more full of wonder. They had found each other in the midst of chaos, two wounded souls reaching out across the void, and together they had built something that would outlast them both, a legacy of love, of hope, of the simple, radical act of showing up. That was enough. more than enough. That was everything, and so it continued. Elijah graduated high school at the top of his class, delivering a commencement speech that left half the audience in tears. He enrolled at the State University the following fall, majoring in social work with a minor in nonprofit management. The Elijah Project continued to grow, expanding to new districts, training new mentors, touching new lives. Marcus retired from the school the following year, though retired was perhaps too strong a word. He became the project's full-time volunteer coordinator, traveling between sites, training mentors, and occasionally stepping in to work directly with students who needed a little extra attention. He also started speaking at schools and community centers, sharing his story with anyone who would listen. He talked about the importance of reaching out to kids who seemed invisible, of creating spaces where they could be seen and heard and valued. He talked about his own journey, the wars he'd fought, the demons he'd conquered, the boy who had saved him as much as he had saved the boy. "You never know which connection is going to make the difference," he would say. "You never know which moment of kindness is going to be the one that changes everything. So you show up. Every time, every day, you show up, because that's what it means to be human." The responses varied. Some people listened politely and moved on. Others approached him afterward, tears in their eyes, wanting to share their own stories of loss and redemption. A few, a precious few, signed up to become mentors themselves, joining the growing army of adults determined to make sure no child ever felt as alone as Elijah once had. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. There were setbacks and disappointments, kids who slipped through the cracks despite everyone's best efforts, mentors who burned out and couldn't continue. But there were victories too, small and large, private and public, accumulating like raindrops into a river that flowed towards something better. On Elijah's 21st birthday, Marcus threw a surprise party at the community center that had become the project's unofficial headquarters. Everyone was there, Sarah and James, their two young children running around underfoot, the Morrisons, older now, but still sharp. Dr. E. Oilaran, retired but still volunteering her time. Dozens of former mentees who had come back to serve as mentors themselves. And Maya, of course. She and Elijah had been inseparable since high school, their friendship deepening into something more over the years. She stood beside him now, holding his hand, as the crowd sang "Happy Birthday," and the candles flickered on a cake shaped like a chess piece. "Make a wish," she said, her eyes sparkling. Elijah closed his eyes, thought for a moment, then blew out the candles with a single breath. The room erupted in cheers. Later, after the cake had been eaten and the presents opened, Marcus found himself alone with his son in a quiet corner of the room. "So what did you wish for?" he asked. Elijah smiled. "You know I can't tell you that. It won't come true." "Fair enough. But can I guess?" "Go ahead." Marcus pretended to think deeply. "You wished for a new car." "Strike one." $1 million. "Strike two." "The ability to fly." Elijah laughed. "Strike three. And even if I could fly, I wouldn't want to. This is exactly where I'm supposed to be." He looked around the room, taking in the faces of the people who had shaped his life, the mentors who had believed in him, the mentees who had taught him more than he ever taught them, the family he had built piece by piece from the wreckage of his childhood. "I have everything I need," he said, turning back to Marcus. "Everything I ever wished for, thanks to you." Marcus felt the familiar sting of tears, but he blinked them back. "You earned it, every bit of it." "Maybe, but I couldn't have done it without you showing me it was possible." They embraced, two men who had once been strangers, bound now by something stronger than blood. The party continued around them, laughter and music filling the air, but for this moment they were alone in their own small universe. "I love you, Dad," Elijah said. "I love you too, son," Marcus replied. always and forever. And in that moment, surrounded by the family they had built and the lives they had changed, Marcus Cole knew that he had finally found what he'd spent his whole life searching for. Not glory or recognition, not revenge or redemption, not even peace, though he'd found that too along the way. He had found purpose, the quiet, steady purpose of showing up for the people who needed him day after day, year after year. The purpose of building something that would outlast him, something that would ripple outward long after he was gone. He had found home, and it was exactly where he was supposed to be. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. The Elijah Project became a national model, inspiring similar initiatives in cities across the country. Elijah earned his master's degree and took over as executive director, bringing fresh energy and innovative ideas to the organization his suffering had inspired. Marcus stepped back, finally allowing himself to embrace the retirement he'd avoided for so long. He spent his mornings drinking coffee on the fire escape, his afternoons volunteering at the local VA hospital, his evenings surrounded by family and friends. He learned to garden, filling the small plot behind his apartment building with tomatoes and peppers and basil. He read books, actual books, not tactical manuals or mission briefings, and discovered a love of history he hadn't known he possessed. And he watched, with wonder and pride, as the next generation took up the mantle. Sarah's children called him Grandpa, and he spoiled them rotten with treats and adventures. Elijah and Maya got married in a small ceremony at the park, surrounded by everyone who mattered, and Marcus danced at the reception until his feet ached and his heart was full to bursting. The first grandchild arrived 2 years later, a baby girl with her mother's smile and her father's eyes, and Marcus fell in love all over again. One evening, when the baby was 3 months old and Elijah had brought her over for a visit, Marcus held her in his arms and marveled at the tiny perfection of her fingers, her nose, her sleeping face. "She looks like you," he told Elijah, "when you were small. I know, it's kind of terrifying, actually. What if she has all my issues?" "She won't, because she'll have something you didn't have. She'll have a family that sees her, that loves her, that shows up for her no matter what." Elijah nodded slowly, his eyes misting. "That's the plan. It's a good plan." The baby stirred in Marcus's arms, making the small sounds of a child beginning to wake. He rocked her gently, humming a tune he'd almost forgotten, a lullaby his own mother used to sing, decades ago in a different life. "You know what I realized recently," Elijah said. "I spent so many years being angry. Angry at Carl, angry at the world, angry at God, or fate, or whatever you want to call it. I thought that anger was what kept me going, what gave me strength, but it wasn't. It was eating me alive. What changed? You, the Morrisons, Dr. Oyalaran, all the people who refused to give up on me, even when I wanted to give up on myself." Elijah paused. "I learned that the opposite of anger isn't happiness. It's peace. The peace of knowing that you're exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing." Marcus looked at his son, at the man he'd become, and felt that peace wash over him too. After all the battles he'd fought, all the wounds he'd suffered, all the years of wandering in search of meaning, here, at last, was the answer. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't mysterious. It was the simplest thing in the world, hiding in plain sight all along. Love, given freely, received gracefully. The thread that connected everything, that made sense of the chaos, that transformed pain into purpose and strangers into family. "I'm glad you found it," Marcus said softly. "That peace. I'm glad we found it together." The baby woke fully then, her eyes opening to take in the world around her. She looked up at Marcus with that ancient infant gaze, full of wonder and possibility, and he felt the last of his old wounds close over forever. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "Welcome to the family." Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. The city hummed with life, millions of stories unfolding simultaneously, most of them never to be known or told. But here, in this small apartment, a story had reached its conclusion, and another was just beginning. Marcus Cole, former Navy SEAL, maintenance worker, father, grandfather, friend, had found his way home at last, and it was better than anything he could have imagined. It was everything.